Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We had a lot of requests to look into these recent, well, kind of scary aviation incidents that have been happening.
Yeah, I mean, 2025 hasn't exactly had the smoothest start, in the skies.
So, we thought, we'd gather some of the best information we could find. We've got, all the news articles about these incidents, of course, but
Mm.
we've also got some expert interviews with pilots, safety investigators,
Mhm.
and even some folks in charge up at the FAA, industry leaders.
Really trying to get a full perspective on this.
Exactly. So what we're going to try and do today is figure out why it seems like these aviation incidents are all happening at once. And we'll try to see if there are any kind of, bigger picture things going on.
Yeah, are these just random events or is there something else at play here?
Exactly. So, we've got to start somewhere. What do you think is a good way to kind of frame this whole discussion?
Well, I think it makes sense to start with the sheer volume of air traffic. I mean, there are thousands of planes in the air at any given moment, right? An NBC Chicago interview with a couple of pilots, Stephen Holt and Brant Miller, I think they said something like 16,000 planes are in the air at once.
Wow.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. And Brant Miller, he actually shared some of his own personal experiences with close calls. It's like, even with all the safety measures in place, you're bound to have some close calls just because of the sheer number of planes up there.
So it's like, statistically speaking, incidents are almost inevitable.
Kinda, yeah. But here's the thing, they also talked about how far safety technology has come. I mean, things like TCS, which is the Traffic Alert and Collision Avoidance System,
Yeah.
and ADSB, that's the Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast.
So, for those of us who aren't pilots, can you break down what that ADSB thingy does?
Sure, sure. Basically, it's like every plane is broadcasting its location in real time. It's super accurate, and it gives everyone, the pilots, the air traffic controllers, even us on our flight tracking apps, a much clearer picture of what's happening in the sky. It helps prevent those close calls from becoming actual collisions.
So better awareness all around.
Exactly. And that brings us to another point that the pilots in that interview brought up, the whole transparency thing. Like now with ADSB and, everyone having a smartphone and social media, even a minor incident, like say a wingtip clip on the ground, is going to get blasted all over the internet. And it can make people think, oh my God, the skies are falling. But really, it might have happened before and nobody even knew.
Yeah, we're just more aware of these incidents now.
Right. And it's important to remember that major commercial accidents, those with fatalities or serious injuries or, significant aircraft damage, those have been pretty rare, thankfully, since that Colgan air crash back in 2009.
That was a really tough one.
Absolutely. And speaking of accidents versus incidents, the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, they have a very specific definition for what constitutes an accident.
So not every incident is a full-blown accident.
Right. An accident is a serious event, something with major consequences. Now, a WFAA transcript we looked at, they did a good job explaining the NTSB's whole process. See, they investigate everything, every accident and incident. And while they can usually figure out what happened pretty quickly, it takes way longer to really understand the how and the why.
Because that's the complicated part, right?
Totally. They got to look at weather conditions, human factors, any mechanical problems. I mean, it's a huge investigation, and it can take a year or more for them to release their final report.
But that makes sense, right? Because
Yeah.
every incident, no matter how big or small, it's a chance to learn something
Hmm.
and maybe even prevent something worse from happening down the line.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of the specifics. We've got that midair collision over the Potomac River back in January, the one with the Black Hawk helicopter and the PSA Airlines jet near DCA, Reagan National. The preliminary report from the NTSB, which was covered by WFAA and News Nation, it really revealed some shocking stuff.
Like what? What stood out to you?
Well, the number of close calls near DCA, they had over 15,000 incidents between October 2021 and December 2024, where planes got like way too close for comfort,
Way too close. How close are we talking?
less than a nautical mile apart horizontally, and only 400 feet vertically. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. I mean, that's more than 10 close calls every single day in that airspace. And the TCS, remember that collision avoidance system? It was issuing alerts like at least once a month because helicopters were getting too close to other aircraft.
So basically a lot of near misses happening.
Yeah. And the NTSB, they didn't mince words. They sent some urgent safety recommendations to the FAA about those helicopter routes around DCA, calling it an intolerable risk. Like they basically said, these separation distances, they're not nearly enough. I mean, in some cases, the vertical separation could be as little as 75 feet.
75 feet. That's like, what, two school buses stacked on top of each other?
Pretty much. They also pointed out that some of those helicopter routes don't have clear lateral boundaries, which adds to the risk.
It's kind of scary to think that it took a collision for them to finally say something. It makes you wonder why these issues weren't addressed sooner, especially since they had all this data about the close calls.
That's a great point. I mean, in the WFAA transcript, the NTSB representative seemed to imply that the data was there. It's
Yeah.
like maybe the system for reporting and acting on these near misses, maybe it needs some tweaking.
Yeah, how do we learn from these close calls before they turn into something worse?
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about that landing incident in Toronto. Thankfully, everyone survived that one, which is a testament to the crew's evacuation procedures.
Oh, yeah, that was all over the news. NBC Chicago, CBS News, everyone was covering it. It really highlighted how important those pre-flight safety briefings are, knowing where your exits are and what to do in an emergency. It can literally save your life.
No kidding. And then you've got the small plane crash in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. That was covered by Rickle TV and Live No W from FOX. President Trump even commented on it, saying that these types of incidents with smaller planes, they happen from time to time and aren't always indicative of some bigger problem.
It's a good reminder that general aviation, flying smaller planes, comes with its own set of risks. It's different from commercial aviation.
For sure. And, it can feel like these incidents are piling up, especially when you see them all listed out in a timeline, like that one in the WESH2 news report. They had the DC collision, the Philadelphia medical transport crash, the commuter flight crashed in Alaska, and then that Orlando flight that had to divert because the windshield cracked.
When you put it like that, it sounds like a lot.
It does, but that same WESH2 news report also pointed out the importance of keeping things in perspective. Like, statistically speaking, flying is still way safer than driving. They even had some numbers from 2022 to back that up. 356 deaths in plane accidents versus over 42,000 on the roads. It's a stark difference.
So while these incidents are definitely concerning, it's not time to panic and swear off flying altogether.
Exactly. And, whenever there's talk about budget cuts, like those proposed for the FAA, people start wondering if safety is being compromised.
And those concerns are understandable.
Absolutely. But in the Fox News and CBS News transcripts, we saw both the Delta CEO and Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy addressing those concerns head on. They said that essential safety positions like air traffic controllers and inspectors, they were protected from those cuts. And they even emphasized that they're still hiring for those roles.
So the message seems to be we're streamlining things, but we're not cutting corners on safety.
That's the idea, yeah. Now, it's tempting to try and connect all these recent incidents, find some grand unifying theory, but I think the analysis from the Mentor Now transcript makes a really important point about that.
What'd they say?
They basically cautioned against looking for a single cause, arguing that these incidents, they're all pretty diverse. They looked at a bunch of incidents from around the world and found a whole range of triggers. Like one was maybe a missile strike, another was a blown tire, then you had landing gear malfunctions, an aircraft fire, the mid-air collision we talked about, even a medical emergency that led to a crash.
So basically, a whole mixed bag of causes.
Yeah. And they warned against jumping to conclusions, especially before we have all the facts. They brought up the Boeing 737 MAX crashes as an example of how quickly narratives can form, even when they're not completely accurate.
That's a good reminder to be cautious about drawing those big, sweeping conclusions. Every incident needs to be investigated individually.
Totally. And speaking of Boeing, the Bloomberg Originals transcript brought up some of the problems they've been having lately. Those lingering 737 AX issues, concerns about their quality control, limits on their production, and how all that's impacting the availability of planes.
Yeah, that was a pretty deep dive into Boeing's struggles. It sounded like they've had some cultural shifts, maybe focusing more on profits for shareholders than on engineering and safety.
That's what the transcript suggested, yeah.
Hmm.
And while those are definitely major concerns, they're more about Boeing's internal stuff, not necessarily the driving force behind this perceived increase in incidents across the whole industry.
So where does that leave us?
Well, it seems like there's no single smoking gun here, no one thing that's causing all these incidents.
It's more complicated than that.
Way more. It's a combination of factors. The sheer volume of air traffic, increased reporting and awareness, specific issues at certain airports like what we saw with DCA, and then just a bunch of random events, each with its own unique cause.
And while it's easy to get caught up in the headlines and feel like the sky is falling, the data still shows that flying is incredibly safe.
Absolutely. And the aviation industry, they're constantly working to improve safety. They investigate every incident, learn from it, and make the necessary changes to regulations, procedures, training, everything.
It's a constant process of improvement.
It has to be.
Yeah.
Now, here's something for everyone to think about. We live in a world of instant information, right? Everything is on social media, and we're bombarded with news 24/7. So, how do we balance staying informed about these aviation incidents without letting anxiety take over?
That's a good question. It's about finding reliable sources, like the NTSB, and not just relying on sensational headlines.
Right. It's about being informed without being overwhelmed. It's a challenge, but it's one worth thinking about.
Absolutely. So keep those critical thinking skills sharp, everyone, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See them?